Today, as we talk about Saul loving his enemies, we're continuing on a theme that we have seen in Samuel for a long time. Themes of obedience, themes of trusting in the Lord, themes of finding out the Lord's will in our lives. And sometimes I think that we use language that we're not all familiar with. So I thought we would translate some of these terms into words that everyone could understand. And so I've been thinking about the spring game and Nebraska football and Tecumseh getting drafted, and I'm I got really football on the mind this spring. And so I thought, well, maybe I could translate some of these churchy terms more into football terms so that we all be on the same page. Extra point. That's when you receive what you receive when you tell the preacher his sermon was too short. You get extra points. You should remember that. Face mask. That's smiling and saying everything is all right even when it isn't. So, that's what a face mask is. Draft choice. We've talked about Tecumseh. That's the decision to sit close to an air conditioner vent.
Amen.
Now, you have to know in our church that the only two vents we have for air conditioning are right there on the walls. So if you really want to be cold, you got to adjust yourself in this room. Or if you want to be warm in the wintertime, you got to adjust yourself. So that's draft choice. So draw play. That's what restless children do during the long sermons. Whatever you have, whatever you need, that's what you need to have. End around, that's taking place right now in the nursery, diaper changing. End zone, those are the pews. Hash marks, stains left on the tablecloths after potluck. Head linesman, that's Brad, the one who changes the slides and the projector during the song. He's the head linesman, right? Illegal motion, that's leaving before the last song. In the pocket. Now, this is my favorite. That's where some church members keep God's money. Okay? All right, interference, that's talking during the prelude. Okay, when Ruby's playing, that's interference. And the 2-minute warning, that's when the pastor's wife looks at her watch in full view of the pastor. It never does any good. Some of you may remember Andy Herman, and her dad was preaching for us one time, and he was going long. He was a retired gentleman and never got enough time in the pulpit, and he was up there preaching, and she was looking at her watch and waving at him, and finally she just went up to the pulpit and got him. He wasn't going to give up for nothing. Anyway, that's the 2-minute warning, and Beth will wave at me or whatever, and we'll get that taken care of. Saul is dead here in our chapter today, and I picked a portrait of grief. I really like this picture. I think it is very expressive. It's like there's a storm inside of him, and the tears flow, and he doesn't know what to do. And really, this is a low point in Israel's history when Saul died. The nation was divided in half by the Philistines. Their king was dead. The Lord's anointed was dead. For all they knew, David was hanging out with the Philistines and had participated in this. Everything had gone wrong that could go wrong. And there was a lot of grief in the air. And David is not automatically king. We've been reading about David a while now. We know that God wants him to be king. We know that God has ordained him to be king, anointed him to be king. But he's not automatically king. In the real world, just because God has ordained something doesn't mean that we don't have to go through some struggles to get to the place where God wants us to be. And David has to go through those struggles as well. And so he is not automatically king. In this chapter today, we see that he is anointed king over the southern part here where it says Judah. A guy named Ishbosheth takes over in the north. He is another son of Saul's that is making a claim to be a king in Israel. They still had the Philistines, they still had the Moabites, they still had the Amalekites to the south, the Ammonites, and everybody else. And really, with the nation divided and the king gone like it was, they were ripe for the picking. Now, this contrast between David and Saul continues. It continues through his son, Ishbosheth. Ishbosheth, we will see, is just chip off the old block. The acorn didn't fall very far from the tree in his case. He wanted to be king by political maneuvers, but not by inquiring of the Lord. And we'll see the contrast between Saul and David as those continue. And after years of running from Saul, though, we might expect David to just be happy. Saul's dead. Yes, I can be king. I don't have to worry about my life anymore. But that is not the case. He grieves. He grieves. And he is still willing to wait patiently for God to move. He knows that he's been ordained by God to be king, but he still waits patiently for God to move, even as David does the things that God has asked him to do. He still waits on what the Lord wants him to do. As we start looking at this chapter, in chapter 1, we first read about the report of Saul's death. There is an interesting question, if you were paying attention last week and this week, about who killed Saul. Last week we read that the Philistines had wounded him and that he had escaped from the battle. He asked his armor-bearer to kill him. His armor-bearer refused, and so Saul killed himself, fell on his sword and killed himself. And then his armor-bearer killed himself as well. Well, today we read about this Amalekite. You know, I don't think that the person who put the book of Samuel together was an idiot. I don't think he thought this was a problem. And we may not have the right solution, but I think he had a point to make. I think he was trying to say that the Amalekite is a liar. That he was trying to get ahead in this world, that he was just there bragging, that he figured David would never find out, and he figured that David would love him if he was the one who killed Saul. He had obviously seen Saul because he had his crown. He had the armband that he had. But this messenger is not likely to be well received. You know, David has just gotten back from having a battle with the Amalekites, with having a battle with those terrorists, and now here's another terrorist coming saying, hey, I killed Saul. Well, David's not likely to believe him in the first place. But he has a crown and he has the armband. And David has to believe him when he says, I killed Saul. Even though I think the author is telling us he's lying. He's bragging. He's just trying to get into David's good graces by having killed Saul. After all, I think he only understands power, and I think he's saying, hey, if I kill him, David will be king. He'll reward me for having killed Saul. I think one of the reasons why the author of Samuel puts this in